The air inside the grand, mahogany-paneled courtroom hung thick with the weight of expectancy. The long, arched windows allowed only slanted streams of afternoon sunlight to spill onto the polished floors, their golden beams illuminating the dust that swirled lazily in the stagnant air. The steady hum of murmured conversations ebbed and flowed between the towering bookshelves and the high-backed wooden chairs, as if the very room were whispering its own silent judgments. At the center of it all, Pam Bondi sat in quiet contemplation, her features composed, her gaze unwavering. A woman of poise and precision, she exuded an aura of self-assuredness that some mistook for defiance. Those who knew her well understood better. There was no defiance in her posture, only an unshakable resolve. Her sharp blue eyes, honed from years of cross-examinations and fiery legal battles, remained fixed on the figure seated high above the courtroom, the judge. Judge Samuel Harrington, a man known for his unyielding adherence to procedural rigidity, adjusted his glasses and peered down at her over the rim. His gavel rested idly at his side, yet his presence alone held the same finality as if it had already struck. He cleared his throat, his voice a deep, gravelly echo that settled over the courtroom like a heavy shroud. "Miss Bondi," he began, his tone deliberate, measured. "After careful review of the facts presented, I find that you have, in fact, violated procedural requirements regarding your legal filings. As a result, I am issuing a fine in the amount of—" He paused momentarily, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in. $25,000. A ripple of hushed voices swayed through the gallery, a low murmur of curiosity and intrigue. Some smirked at the irony of a renowned attorney being reprimanded in such a public fashion. Others merely observed, taking note of the rare spectacle. Pam Bondi, the indomitable former Attorney General of Florida, being held accountable under the very legal framework she had once so fiercely upheld. She did not flinch. Not a muscle in her face betrayed even the slightest flicker of emotion. Instead, she inclined her head slightly, a mere acknowledgement of the verdict, and folded her hands neatly in front of her. To the untrained eye, it might have appeared as resignation, but to those who truly watched her, who understood the depth of her intellect, it was something far more calculated. Across the room, the opposing counsel, a smug, self-satisfied man who had relished every second of the hearing, allowed a victorious smirk to curl across his lips. He leaned back in his chair, relishing the sight of a woman he had long considered an insurmountable force finally brought low. His expression carried an unspoken message, an assumption he had already cemented in his mind. Pam Bondi had lost. But she had not. Pam reached for a leather-bound portfolio that rested beside her, her movements smooth, deliberate. As she unfastened the clasp, her fingers brushed against the crisp edges of the meticulously prepared documents inside. Each page was a carefully curated weapon, a precise countermeasure to the very decision that had just been handed down. She stood, slowly, her presence commanding the room without effort. The judge's eyes flickered with something almost imperceptible. Was it curiosity? Hesitation? Even the opposing counsel stiffened slightly, his earlier confidence wading into the shallows of uncertainty. "Your Honor," Pam's voice rang through the chamber with the kind of clarity that demanded attention. "I respectfully request a review of the legal basis for this ruling." Judge Harrington arched a brow. "Miss Bondi, the ruling is final." She nodded, undeterred. "I understand, Your Honor, and I am not questioning your authority. However, I believe a fundamental error in statutory interpretation has been made, one that, when examined thoroughly, will render this fine not only improper, but entirely without merit." A silence settled over the courtroom. The weight of her words, the sheer certainty behind them, created an almost imperceptible shift in the air. The judge leaned forward slightly, as if drawn toward her by some unseen force. Even the clerk, a woman who had sat through countless proceedings, found herself gripping her pen a little tighter. Pam turned a single page in her portfolio, revealing a section of dense legal text underlined in precise, Crimson ink. According to the procedural statutes governing this case, the provision cited in your ruling, while seemingly applicable, contains a caveat. One that nullifies the penalties prescribed if certain conditions are met. Judge Harrington narrowed his gaze. And you believe those conditions apply to this case? Pam's lips quirked in the faintest suggestion of a smile, not one of arrogance, but of certainty. I do, Your Honor. And if you will allow me 3 minutes to present my argument, I am confident you will agree. The opposing counsel scoffed audibly, an attempt to dismiss her stance as little more than desperation. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, a creeping unease. He had seen Pam Bondi dismantle entire cases with nothing but a paragraph of legal text and a razor-sharp mind. He had underestimated her before, and it had cost him. Judge Harrington sighed, his fingers drumming lightly against the wooden desk before him. He was a man of the law, and the law required diligence. And so, with a reluctant nod, he motioned for her to proceed. The moment was hers. Pam Bondi straightened, the quiet power of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing radiating from every deliberate movement. The courtroom leaned in, metaphorically and physically, as she began to speak, not with urgency, nor with desperation, but with the calm precision of a mind that had already won before the battle had even begun. And as she laid out her argument, it became clear to all who listened. This was not a woman who had been bested. This was a woman who had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal exactly who she was. Pam Bondi stood firm, the weight of expectation pressing against her like an invisible tide. The courtroom, once filled with hushed amusement at her supposed defeat, now hung in rapt silence. Every eye followed her movements as she turned the legal document before her, each page a meticulously curated testament to her relentless preparation. The air seemed charged, as if the very walls of the courtroom understood that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Judge Harrington adjusted his glasses, the slight movement betraying a flicker of curiosity that had not been present before. He was no stranger to legal battles, nor to attorneys who fought tooth and nail for their clients. But there was something different about this moment, something that made him hesitate before delivering another finality-sealed declaration. He could feel it in the way Pam stood, in the way her voice carried not the tone of defiance, but of inevitable persuasion. Her fingers traced a line of text in the heavy legal tome before her, the inked letters standing stark against the aged parchment. "Your Honor," she began, her voice smooth and unwavering, "the statute under which I've been penalized operates under the assumption that procedural failure results in negligence. However, the legislative intent of this particular clause does not support an application of penalty where the procedural omission was, in fact, compliant with a superseding doctrine." A murmur swept through the courtroom, subtle yet undeniable. The opposing counsel, whose earlier smirk had barely concealed his satisfaction, shifted slightly in his chair. His carefully crafted confidence now wavered as he reached instinctively for his notes, flipping through them with forced nonchalance, his mind working to catch up with the shift in momentum. He had expected resistance, but what he had not anticipated was the sheer force of logic that Pam Bondi wielded like a scalpel. Judge Harrington leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlocking as he studied the document before him. "Miss Bondi," he said, his tone more measured than before, "are you suggesting that the procedural oversight was, in fact, preempted by another legal precedent?" Pam met his gaze without hesitation, the certainty in her expression leaving no room for doubt. "Yes, Your Honor," she affirmed, turning to a highlighted passage in her document. "The Supreme Court ruled in Calhoun v. State that procedural errors must be evaluated within the context of legislative hierarchy. In instances where a statute conflicts with an overriding legal framework, the governing law takes precedence. The ruling, which has stood unchallenged for over 2 decades, clearly articulates that the omission in question must be examined within the broader legal landscape, rather than in isolation." The gallery remained silent, the tension between spoken words thick enough to be tangible. A few members of the audience exchanged knowing glances, recognizing that this was not merely an argument. It was an intellectual dismantling of the very premise upon which the fine had been levied. Judge Harrington inhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the surface of his desk as he processed the argument. He had spent years on the bench, hearing countless attorneys attempt to maneuver their way out of penalties, but rarely had he encountered one who did so with such meticulous clarity. His eyes flickered toward the opposing counsel, whose earlier smugness had all but evaporated. The man sat rigidly in his seat, his grip on his pen tightening as he began scribbling frantic notes in the margin of his brief. Pam turned the page with deliberate care, her measured cadence never faltering. Furthermore, Your Honor, the secondary condition for penalty issuance stipulates that procedural error must result in substantive harm. The absence of such harm, as evidenced in Henderson v. City of Tampa, negates the basis for punitive action. At that, even the court stenographer glanced up, her fingers pausing momentarily above the keys of her machine. The courtroom, once a stage for Pam's supposed downfall, had become an arena for her intellectual triumph. Judge Harrington exhaled, his gaze shifting once more to the legal text in front of him. The weight of the moment settled upon his shoulders, the undeniable truth of her argument pressing against his initial ruling. The principles of law demanded objectivity, and in that objectivity, he found himself standing at the precipice of reconsideration. Pam Bondi, with nothing more than her knowledge, her preparation, and her unyielding belief in the law, had turned the tide of the entire proceeding. And for the first time in his tenure on the bench, Judge Harrington found himself questioning whether he had misjudged the case before him. The stillness in the courtroom felt almost unnatural, as if the air itself had thickened under the weight of what had just transpired. Pam Bondi, standing tall and unshaken, allowed the silence to settle, understanding that its power was as crucial as the argument she had just presented. A lesser attorney might have rushed to fill the void, mistaking quiet contemplation for uncertainty, but Pam knew better. She had seen this moment before, the precise second when knowledge and persuasion began to shift the very ground beneath a ruling. Judge Harrington leaned back in his chair, his fingers clasped together in deep thought, his brow furrowed in reluctant reconsideration. The authority he wielded was absolute. Yet even the most entrenched judgments could not withstand the force of superior logic. He removed his glasses, polishing them with deliberate slowness, the ritual serving as a thinly veiled attempt to regain the composure that Pam had methodically stripped away. The opposing counsel, whose earlier demeanor had brimmed with self-assurance, now sat rigidly in his chair, his knuckles whitening against the pages of his brief. His gaze flickered toward Pam, a silent acknowledgement that whatever battle he thought he had won had now become something far more precarious. He cleared his throat, a futile effort to inject himself back into the proceedings, but even he could feel it. His footing had crumbled, his argument unraveled, and the weight of the moment belonged entirely to the woman standing before the court. Pam turned another page, her movements unhurried, each gesture an unspoken declaration of control. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice steady and unwavering, "the foundation of jurisprudence rests upon the principles of fairness and precedent. If we allow penalties to be imposed outside the scope of legislative intent, we risk setting a dangerous precedent, one that undermines the very integrity of our legal system." A murmur rippled through the gallery, subtle but unmistakable, a quiet confirmation that those listening understood the significance of her words. Judges prided themselves on adherence to precedent, for in its consistency lay the bedrock of justice. To disregard the very framework upon which rulings were built would be akin to eroding the foundation of the law itself. Judge Harrington exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the wooden desk, his mind caught in the web of legal precision Pam had so effortlessly woven. He was a man of principle, known for his strict interpretations, but even he could not ignore the glaring reality before him. His ruling, though initially sound in its procedural basis, now stood on unsteady ground. Pam continued, her cadence deliberate, her argument now reaching its crescendo. In Jefferson versus State, the appellate court ruled that judicial discretion must always be exercised within the confines of statutory interpretation. In that case, the presiding judge amended a penalty after it became clear that the application of the law had been flawed. The very court that issued the ruling later reaffirmed its position, stating that when knowledge supplants assumption, justice demands reconsideration. At those words, the tension in the room shifted once more, no longer a passive acknowledgement of her reasoning, but an active engagement with the undeniable logic she had presented. Even those who had initially dismissed her, who had smirked at the notion of Pam Bondi facing defeat, now found themselves watching in silent admiration. The opposing counsel's pen hovered uselessly over his notes, the once formidable structure of his case reduced to fragments before his very eyes. He had anticipated a fight, had relished the prospect of a courtroom victory against one of the most formidable legal minds in the country, but he had underestimated the sheer depth of her preparation. Pam Bondi was not merely defending herself. She was dismantling the very argument that had been constructed against her. Judge Harrington shifted in his seat, his eyes scanning the pages of legal text before him, the weight of his next words pressing against the room like an impending storm. He was not a man easily swayed, nor one to admit error lightly, but the evidence before him left little room for pride or stubbornness. Pam stepped back slightly, not in retreat, but in anticipation of what she already knew was inevitable. She had seen it before: the measured breaths, the deliberate silences, the slow unraveling of a decision made too hastily. This was the moment when the law, in all its complexity, demanded humility from those who wielded it. Judge Harrington finally set his glasses down, his gaze sweeping the courtroom before settling once more on Pam. The air was electric with expectation, the final strands of resistance fraying against the undeniable strength of her argument. He adjusted his posture, the weight of judicial responsibility settling upon his shoulders, and in that moment, Pam knew justice was no longer a question, but a certainty. A heavy silence gripped the courtroom, thick with the weight of expectation, as Judge Harrington pressed his fingertips together in measured contemplation. The leather of his chair creaked slightly as he shifted his position, his expression betraying no immediate indication of where his deliberations might lead. His gaze flickered over the dense legal text sprawled across his desk, the very statutes that had once seemed so straightforward, now tangled in the web of logic Pam Bondi had masterfully spun. Across the room, the opposing counsel sat rigid, his earlier confidence now reduced to a pale imitation of what it had been. His fingers twitched involuntarily against the legal pad resting on his lap, the scribbled notes upon it rendered useless by the unrelenting precision of Pam's argument. He had believed himself victorious before the trial had even begun, assured that she would be unable to maneuver her way out of the penalty imposed upon her. But now, with each passing second, the reality of his miscalculation became undeniable. Pam remained poised, standing as still as a marble statue, her presence as unwavering as the very laws she had invoked. She understood the mechanics of justice better than most. She knew that once the seed of doubt had been planted in a judge's mind, it took root quickly, spreading through every corner of reason and demanding acknowledgement. It was not arrogance that kept her composed, nor was it defiance. It was an unshakable confidence in the principles of law itself, a belief that truth, when presented without flaw, was impossible to deny. Judge Harrington exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood of his bench. His reputation had been built on consistency, on measured rulings that left little room for ambiguity. Yet now he found himself wrestling with the inescapable realization that his initial judgment had been premature. The evidence was overwhelming, the statutes irrefutable, and the logic behind Pam's arguments so airtight that any further resistance would be an exercise in futility. "Miss Bondi," he finally said, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant reconsideration, It is clear that your argument has introduced complexities that were not fully explored during my initial review of this case. A murmur swept through the gallery, subtle yet unmistakable, a reaction not merely to the words spoken, but to the shift in the very fabric of the proceedings. The gavel, which had seemed so final only moments ago, now rested as little more than an ornamental relic, its authority undermined by the sheer force of superior reasoning. The opposing counsel sat up straighter, his lips pressing into a thin line as he prepared a rebuttal, desperate to salvage what little control he had left over the case. But as he parted his lips, ready to object, Judge Harrington raised a hand, his expression signaling that the time for debate had passed. Pam remained silent, knowing that the argument had already been won. There was no need for further persuasion, no last-minute flourish of rhetoric. She had presented her case with precision, and the law itself now stood in her defense. She had not merely argued for the dismissal of a penalty. She had exposed a fundamental flaw in the very reasoning that had led to it in the first place. Judge Harrington's gaze flickered downward, his eyes tracing the highlighted passages of the legal document Pam had referenced. The clarity of the precedent she had cited left little room for personal discretion. It demanded only one course of action, one conclusion that could not, in good conscience, be ignored. "I am prepared," he continued, his tone measured, "to reconsider my previous ruling in light of the arguments presented here today." The words, though delivered with the same judicial neutrality as any other statement he had made, reverberated through the courtroom like the pealing of a bell. The murmurs in the gallery swelled slightly, an acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just transpired. Few attorneys could claim to have turned a judge's ruling in real time, and even fewer had done so with the effortless precision Pam Bondi had just displayed. The opposing counsel's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line as he gripped the edges of his notes with enough force to crumple them. He had entered this courtroom with the expectation of an easy victory, a spectacle that would cement his reputation as the attorney who had bested one of the most formidable legal minds in the country. But now, faced with the undeniable reality of his miscalculation, he found himself trapped in a moment of helpless inertia. Pam, ever composed, offered no reaction beyond the faintest incline of her head. She did not gloat, nor did she revel in the discomfort of her opponent. She had not come here to humiliate, nor to seek validation. She had come to uphold the principles of justice, and in doing so, she had accomplished precisely what she had set out to do. Judge Harrington reached for his gavel, his expression one of reluctant acknowledgement, the finality of his impending decision already written in the furrow of his brow. But before he could strike the wooden sound block before him, he paused, allowing the weight of the moment to linger just a little longer. Pam remained still, the quiet storm of intellect and integrity that had defined her every movement now culminating in this singular, defining moment. The ruling that had once seemed set in stone was now crumbling under the force of irrefutable logic. And as the judge prepared to issue his final statement, it became clear to everyone present. This was no longer about a fine, nor about procedural oversight. This was about the power of knowledge, the resilience of preparation, and the undeniable truth that those who underestimated Pam Bondi did so at their own peril. The finality of the moment stretched across the courtroom like an invisible force, the weight of it pressing down on every soul present. Judge Harrington's fingers tightened around the handle of his gavel, his grip betraying the unspoken tension that lingered between the decision he had rendered and the reality that had now emerged. The air, thick with anticipation, seemed to pause in deference to the gravity of what was about to unfold. Pam Bondi stood motionless, her presence as unshakable as the law she had invoked, the quiet storm of intellect she wielded now settling into something almost serene. She had navigated the battlefield of legal discourse with the precision of a master strategist, unraveling the very foundation upon which the opposing counsel had built his case. Her work was complete, her argument irrefutable, and now the final blow did not belong to her. It belonged to the law itself. Judge Harrington inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling with the measured deliberation of a man who understood that to resist truth in the face of undeniable logic would be to betray the very principles he had sworn to uphold. He glanced once more at the documents laid before him, as if searching for a loophole that might allow him to stand by his initial ruling. But there was none. The law, in all its intricate complexity, had been wielded flawlessly by the woman standing before him, and in doing so, had left no room for interpretation. "This court," he said, his voice firm yet burdened with the weight of reversal, "finds sufficient merit in the arguments presented to warrant reconsideration of the penalty issued against Miss Bondi." The silence that followed was not one of shock, nor one of mere acknowledgement. It was something far deeper, something closer to reverence. The opposing counsel sat frozen, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the finality of the judge's words, the slow realization settling in that whatever dominance he had once held in this proceeding had been completely and irreversibly dismantled. Judge Harrington lifted his gavel, the motion deliberate, his next words carrying the unmistakable tone of judicial authority. "The fine previously imposed is hereby vacated, effective immediately, and this court formally acknowledges the precedents outlined by the defense." A single strike of the gavel punctuated the ruling, a sound that echoed through the courtroom like the closing note of a symphony. The decision was made, the record corrected, and justice, true, unyielding justice, had prevailed. Pam allowed the smallest exhale, not of relief, but of quiet satisfaction, the kind that came not from victory, but from the reaffirmation of something far greater than herself. She had not won because of reputation, nor because of charm or theatrics. She had won because she was right, because preparation and precision had carried her through where assumption and arrogance had sought to silence her. Across the courtroom, the opposing counsel leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumping under the weight of defeat, his once assured smirk now replaced with a vacant stare. He had entered this battle certain that his victory was inevitable, that the might of procedural authority would be enough to bring Pam Bondi to heel. But he had learned, as many had before him, that intelligence wielded with discipline was a force far greater than bravado alone. Judge Harrington gave a single nod before rising, signaling the official close of the proceedings. The bailiff called out the standard dismissal, but the words barely registered among those present. Everyone, it seemed, was still absorbing the magnitude of what had just transpired. As Pam gathered her documents with steady hands, she did not linger in the moment, nor did she acknowledge the stolen glances cast in her direction. She had no need for validation, no interest in reveling in the discomfort of those who had underestimated her. The law had spoken, and that alone was enough. As she turned to leave, a subtle shift in the room caught her attention. Judge Harrington, having stepped away from the bench, regarded her with an expression that was neither stern nor conceding, but something closer to admiration. His lips parted as if to say something, perhaps an acknowledgement of her skill or a lesson learned in underestimation. But he stopped himself, choosing instead to offer a simple, measured nod, one that spoke volumes without a single word. Pam returned the gesture with equal simplicity before making her way toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step a quiet affirmation of a lesson that had been made undeniable. Never judge people superficially or prematurely. The apparent simplicity of a moment may disguise the depths of brilliance that lie beneath, waiting for the perfect time to emerge. Those who underestimated intelligence, preparation, or the quiet force of certainty often found themselves standing amid the ruins of their own assumptions. And as the doors to the courtroom swung open and the cool air of the hallway embraced her, Pam Bondi walked forward, not in triumph, but in the steady, measured certainty of a woman who had never once needed anyone's permission to prove her worth.